You didn't miss the deadline. You never had the wrong timeline. Something inside you refused. While everyone around you was choosing careers, identities, relationships, confidence, something in you kept pulling back. Not from fear, from something older, something you couldn't name. They called it hesitation. They called it wasted potential. They called you too sensitive, too slow, too much. But what if the delay wasn't the problem? What if it was the process? Carl Jung spent his life studying the people the world wrote off too early, and what he found will reframe everything you've been told about success, timing, and the kind of person you actually are. Act 1. The refusal. There is a moment, most people don't talk about it, when you realize you simply cannot do what everyone else seems to do so easily. You see your peers sign contracts, commit to careers, marry, buy homes, announce themselves, and you watch, not with contempt, not with laziness, with something you can only describe as a deep internal resistance, as if something beneath your conscious mind is shaking its head and saying, not yet, not like this, not this. That moment doesn't feel like wisdom, it feels like failure. Jung observes something that most modern psychology is still not ready to say plainly. Human beings do not all develop on the same schedule, and the most internally complex among us develop on a schedule that society has no patience for. The people who adapt quickly, who choose early, who absorb the values around them and build confident identities from borrowed materials, they are not more evolved. They are more efficient. And efficiency for a certain kind of soul is a trap. When you were young, you probably sensed this without words. You felt more than other children around you, and yet you couldn't explain what you felt. You asked questions that didn't fit the classroom. You sat with emotions that had no name. You were, in a very real sense, a person whose inner world was already older than their outer life. Jung would say your unconscious was unusually active. This is not a compliment or a diagnosis. It is simply a description of a psyche that is already doing interior work, while the rest of the world is focused on exterior performance. And here is the cost of that. When your inner world is louder than the world outside, adaptation becomes genuinely painful. You cannot just become what society asks. You cannot simply choose an identity off a shelf, wear it, and call it yourself. Not because you are rebellious, but because something in you knows the difference between a costume and a soul. So you hesitate, you delay, you lose time, or what others insist on calling time. And the world does what it always does with people it cannot categorize. It reaches for its simplest tools. It calls you lazy. It calls you difficult. It calls you unfocused. It calls you, and this one stings the most, a waste. Act 2. The pain years. Let's not skip past this part. The pain deserves its own chapter. In your 20s, when the contrast becomes sharpest, something that can only be described as a private grief sets in. You watch people who once seemed identical to you, same school, same starting point, same raw material, and now they have titles, partners, assurance. A forward motion that seems effortless to them. You, meanwhile, are still in the question, still circling, still unable to commit to a path you don't believe in, still unable to pretend the game means something it doesn't mean to you. Jung was unafraid to call this what it actually is, not stagnation, but incubation. Consider what happens inside an egg before it becomes a bird. To the eye, nothing. Stillness, waiting, apparent uselessness, but inside, transformation so total that what emerges is nothing like what was there before. The shell does not move. The shell does not perform. The shell simply holds, and holding is in its own way a form of extraordinary labour. Your wandering years, the jobs that didn't fit, the relationships that almost worked, the careers you started and abandoned, the mornings you lay awake asking questions you couldn't answer, were not wasted. They were your shell. Because while others were building social structures, you were being asked by your own psyche to answer questions that most human beings postpone until they are in their 50s and their carefully constructed life begins to crack from the inside. Who am I when no one is watching? Which of my values were chosen, and which were simply inherited? What is the difference between what I want and what I was taught to want? What part of me is a performance, and what is actually real? These questions slow you down. They are supposed to. They are the most expensive and most necessary questions a human being can ask, and the cost is paid in exactly the currency that feels most unbearable: time. Jung documented something in his clinical observations that the self-help industry still hasn't absorbed. A significant portion of people who succeed brilliantly in their 20s and 30s experience a form of interior collapse by midlife. Depression, emptiness, the peculiar terror of realizing that you built everything you were told to build and still feel like a stranger in your own life. This is not weakness. This is the delayed bill for skipping the questions. The person who is still wandering in their 30s is not behind. They are paying the bill early, when it is still small enough to survive. Act 3. The weight of seeing too clearly. Here is something Jung said that most people find uncomfortable. Greater consciousness brings greater suffering. This is not philosophy for its own sake. It is a clinical observation. And if you recognize yourself in this portrait, it may explain something you have never fully been able to articulate about your life. You have probably always seen things that others seemed not to see. The performance beneath the confidence, the insecurity driving the achievement, the meaninglessness beneath the busyness. The way entire social systems run not on genuine connection, but on shared agreements to pretend. And this seeing, this unsolicited clarity, made early participation extraordinarily difficult for you. Think of someone who is handed a script for a play they don't believe in, performed on a stage they find unconvincing, for an audience they suspect wants the comfort of the familiar far more than they want the truth. Now imagine being asked to give that performance with full conviction, every day, for years. That is what conventional ambition felt like for you, not because you are superior. Because you could see through it. And what you can see through, you cannot fully inhabit. So you withdrew. Not always physically, in fact, you probably learned to function well enough on the surface. But psychologically, a part of you stepped back, observed, declined to invest fully in a game whose rules seemed arbitrary and whose prizes seemed empty. Jung believed the psyche has its own integrity, that it will, if necessary, sabotage external success in order to protect internal truth. This is why some extraordinarily perceptive people fail precisely when success arrives, not because they are self-destructive, but because their soul refuses to endorse a life it did not choose. This withdrawal was not weakness, it was self-preservation, and though you may have paid for it in social currency, fewer accolades, more confusion, longer searching, you preserved something that those who adapted too quickly often lost: the thread back to yourself. Act 4. The dark passage. There is a stage in this process that must be named honestly, because if it is not named, it can break a person who doesn't understand what is happening to them. Jung called it the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is everything you were never allowed to be, the anger you suppressed to remain acceptable, the grief you never voiced because vulnerability felt dangerous, the envy you refused to acknowledge because good people don't feel envy, the fear that runs beneath every decision you have ever made. Most people spend enormous energy managing their shadow, keeping it contained, presentable, hidden even from themselves. This takes tremendous psychological resources. It is the reason so many people are exhausted by a life that from the outside looks completely manageable. The late blooming personality cannot afford this management strategy, not because they are braver, but because their psyche will not cooperate with the performance. The inner world is too loud. The shadow surfaces whether it is invited or not. And so, in their pain years, they are forced into an intimacy with their own darkness that most people never experience until crisis forces the encounter. They study their own envy instead of hiding it. They examine their anger instead of sublimating it into ambition. They sit with their fear long enough to understand what it is actually protecting. They trace their contradictions back to their origins. This is exhausting work. It looks, from the outside, like a person drowning in introspection. And at its most intense, particularly in the late 20s and early 30s, it can tip into genuine crisis. Some people lose themselves here. They numb the process. They conform. They adopt an identity that isn't theirs just to make the internal noise stop. Jung's warning was unambiguous. Betraying the emerging self at this stage creates a shadow that will follow the person for the rest of their life. The unlived life does not disappear, it festers. It becomes resentment or depression, or the brittle irritability of someone who gave up on something they can never quite name. But those who endure the darkness without surrendering to it undergo something that cannot be manufactured any other way. The ego, that carefully maintained story about who you are and what you are worth, begins to dissolve, not catastrophically, quietly. And in its dissolution, something older and more durable begins to take its place. Call it the self. Call it authentic character. Call it the person you actually are when you stop auditioning for a role. This is when the real formation begins. And it is invisible to everyone but you. Act 5. The shift no one sees, somewhere in the middle years. For some it is 35, for others 40. For some a little later, something changes. Not in the world, inside. It is not dramatic, it does not announce itself. It does not feel like an arrival so much as a gradual stilling. Anxiety that once felt constant begins to have edges, moments when it simply isn't there. The compulsive need to measure yourself against others loses its grip. The question of what others think of you, which once had the weight of survival, becomes strangely uninteresting. You begin, slowly and then more completely, to trust your own perception, not arrogantly, quietly, with the particular confidence of someone who has tested an instrument many times and learned its reliability. Jung named this moment with a word that has no good equivalent in popular psychology: individuation. And it is not what motivational culture means when it talks about becoming your best self. It is something stranger and more fundamental than that. Individuation is not improvement. It is not optimization. It is not achievement. Individuation is the slow removal of everything that was never yours to begin with. Every borrowed ambition, every inherited fear, every identity assembled from the expectations of people who loved you but did not fully understand you. Every performance maintained for an audience that was not worth the cost. All of it, slowly, almost painfully, falling away. What remains is not impressive in any social sense. It is simply real. And real, in a world saturated with performance, has a particular weight. People begin to feel it before they can explain it. Your words carry more gravity when you speak, not because you are trying harder, but because nothing you say has been pre-filtered for approval. Your decisions carry more clarity because they are no longer negotiated with a committee of imaginary critics. Your presence in a room is different, not louder, not more dominant, but somehow more settled. This is not charisma. Charisma is a skill. This is something older, the particular gravity of a person who is no longer at war with themselves. Act 6. The late flowering. Jung believed that the second half of life is not a continuation of the first, it is an inversion of it. The first half of life is necessarily outward, building, adapting, achieving, establishing. This is appropriate. The world requires it, and the young psyche has the energy for it. But Jung observed that people who remain oriented outward in the second half of life, still chasing status, still building persona, still performing, tend toward a particular kind of interior poverty. The second half of life, in Jung's framework, is for expansion upward, toward meaning, integration, wisdom, depth, not inward in a self-absorbed sense, but inward in the sense of finally understanding the terrain of one's own soul. The late blooming personality arrives at this stage already prepared. Because they were forced inward early, because the external world offered them no comfortable home, they have been doing second half of life work during what everyone else was using as their first half. This is the structural advantage hidden inside years of apparent disadvantage. By 45, while many of their peers are beginning the terrifying work of dismantling identities that no longer serve them, the late bloomer has already done it. By 50, while others are experiencing midlife as crisis, the rare personality is experiencing something quieter and more surprising, a sense of coming home. Their peak comes later. But it comes differently, not as a sprint fueled by urgency and the fear of missing out, but as a long, unhurried movement towards something they have been building toward for decades without fully knowing it. They move into their work with an unhurried precision. Their contributions carry a quality of earned authority, not because they have accumulated credentials, but because they have accumulated themselves. They have learned, through the only reliable school available, how things actually work beneath the surface. They are the ones who see the thing others cannot see. They are the ones who hold the long view in rooms full of people optimizing for the immediate quarter. They are the ones who, when a system starts to fail, understood its fragility years before the failure became visible. And they do not need anyone to acknowledge this. That need died somewhere in the wilderness years, burned away in the same fire that refined everything else. Act 7. The final integration. There is one last test. Jung knew it. He wrote about it carefully. Bitterness. After the wandering, after the shadow work, after the slow and invisible formation, when the late bloomer finally begins to find their footing, the past rises to meet them. And it comes not as wisdom, but as accusation. Look at everything you missed. Look at the years you cannot recover. Look at how far ahead they are. Look at what the delay cost you. This is the final ambush. And many people who survived everything else, fail here. They measure their present self against a false timeline. They pour resentment into the very years that formed them. And the resentment poisons what was built. Those who succeed at this final stage do something that sounds simple and requires everything. They reinterpret the past. Not with denial, not by pretending the pain wasn't real, but by allowing the story to become coherent, by understanding that the wandering was not detour, but foundation, that the failures were not evidence of inadequacy, but the specific education required for the life that was coming. This reframing is not positive thinking. It is a form of psychological surgery, precise, honest, and liberating. When it is complete, something happens that no external accomplishment can produce. The life makes sense. Not to anyone else necessarily, but to you. The pieces fit. The story is yours. The years belong to you. And once a person has arrived at that interior coherence, they become, in Jung's words, something the world has very few of. A fully individuated human being. Not perfect. Not without difficulty, but whole. They become a reference point, not because they sought influence, but because psychological wholeness in a fractured world is unmistakable. People gravitate toward it without being able to explain why. They sense something solid. They borrow steadiness from it. This is the quiet power of the person who took the long way. It does not shout. It does not compete. It simply exists, with a clarity and a completeness that early success, for all its brightness, rarely achieves. If you are still in the wilderness, still in the questioning, still in the wandering, still in the years that feel like delay, this is what is being built beneath your feet. You are not behind. You are in the only process that produces what you are becoming. Stay with it.